So what we're going to do in this video is learn more about the create table command that we learned last class and start adding some constraints. So the first constraint that we want to learn to add is primary key. So there are two ways to add constraints. First of all, when we add those constraints next to the attribute. So here I'm giving the name of my column, the type of my data type, and then I'm adding my constraint. So when we go to each column and give those constraints on the same line as the attribute, we call those unnamed constraints. We're not really giving a name to that constraint. And this is usually the easiest way to create constraints because every attribute you're immediately saying next to it what the constraint is. So here is an example of creating the primary key. So I would say person ID, like for example, if that's the column name, int, and then primary key. And then another type of unnamed constraint is coming to a column and saying that I don't want to allow this column to be null. So I can say not null. So it is mandatory for someone to give me their last name. Here you can see that it's not mandatory for them to give me a first name or an address or a city. And here I'm identifying also that the last name must be unique, for example. And then the default keyword can be used to make sure that you set a default value for a column if the user doesn't specify one. So here I have a country. If they don't tell me the country, I'll say it's USA. The balance, if they don't tell me, I'm going to say it's 100. So let's go to our table of toys that we had created in the last class and see how to create it with constraints. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here, I'm going to go to toy ID, and I'm going to make it the primary key. So I'm going to say that that one's a primary key. Now the toy name, I want to be able to refer to the toy name in a unique manner, so I'm going to make sure that that's not null. And I also want it to be unique. Now if they don't tell me a price, I'm going to say the price is $5. And if they tell me they don't tell me a purchase place, I'm going to say Toys R Us is the default place, and I don't have a purchase date, a default or anything. Okay, if I want to make sure they enter one, I can say not null, for example. But you don't have to have a constraint for every single attribute. You can just add them to the ones that you need. So now I'm going to try clicking on this SQL statement, and I'm going to see that it got created. Now, how can I see these constraints? If I have a table that's already created and I want to see the constraints that exist on this table, how can I do that? So first we're going to come to this side and let's do a refresh. And let's go to the choice table. And it doesn't look like it got refreshed, so let's do the refresh one more time. Okay, and now we see that here the column name is there, the data type is there, and here we can see the constraints. So for the default value, I see that the price has a default value of 5 and the purchase place has a default value of Toys R Us. I see here that the columns that are not nullable, cannot be null, are price and purchase place. So the person cannot leave those as null. If I click on the constraints here, I also can see them. So let's wait for it to load. So here there is a constraints tab that you can click on. And here we have more constraints. So we see that one of the columns is a primary key, but it doesn't really tell us which column. And we see that there's a column that has had the unique name. It doesn't tell us here, but if you click, it tells you downstairs. So the toy name is a column that must be unique. Primary key here, it shows me that it's the toy ID. And then here it has like some constraints that I need to check. I need to make sure that the purchase date is not null. And I need to make sure that the toy name also is not null. So it has all the checks that need to be done. Now, do you see here the constraint name, sys something? this is very user unfriendly. And so what I had to do really, because I couldn't figure out what was going on from here, I had to click on each one and look at the bottom to see what the primary key was, or here which column we're talking about being unique, because here this constraint name was system generated because I didn't create it. So what we said we're doing is we are creating those constraints as unnamed constraints. And so the system generates those unique names for me. And so that's why I see them as unnamed. Now, what if I do want to give them a name so that I can kind of identify the constraints easier later? Well, we can give them names. So what we could do is you can say constraint and then give your constraint a name that means something to you. So let's go back to our database. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this table because we talked about how we can't create the table more than once. So I'm going to say drop table toys. And now that I have it dropped, I can recreate it. So here, what I want to do is I want to say constraint, and then I want to say that this is the primary key constraint. So I'm going to say primary and toy ID. So here I'm saying that the primary key is this column. So I'm going to name this constraint primary toy ID so that I know that this column is the primary key, and the name of the constraint comes from the fact that it's a primary and toy ID. Here I can also name this one. I can say constraint toy name unique, for example, so that I make it unique. And let's run this command and look at the table description once we have it. So let's refresh the other side and let's double click on toys again. And here nothing has changed, but if I click on the constraints, I see now that two of my constraints have names, and this is a little bit easier. Now, why is this more user-friendly? Because we will later see when we learn to insert data into our tables, if we try to insert data that violates one of these constraints, the error message that gets spit out to you will have the constraint name. So when I see toy name unique as an error message, I'm like, oh yeah, the toy name must be unique when I'm inserting here. If I see primary toy ID, I'm like, oh my goodness, maybe I didn't give the toy ID a unique value, so I'm violating the primary toy ID. Or maybe I didn't leave it, so I didn't put it in, so it's null, and I can't because it's a primary key. So this helps the user when they are inserting data, whenever you get a message that violates a constraint, to see what the problem is. If you just get a sysc007013 error message, it means nothing to you as the user. So when we have meaningful constraint names, it makes it a little bit easier to find the problems. Okay. The next thing we want to see is that we can also put those constraints at the table level. So instead of having primary key next to person ID, we can put them here at the end. Now, some people like putting the constraints next to each attribute so that as you look at an attribute, you already immediately see what the constraints with it are. Some people like putting all the constraints at the end of the table so they can see all the constraints at once. This is a programming preference. You choose what is best for you when you go into the real world. For this class, you need to know how to do them both ways because I will ask you on the exam to do it in one way, in one question, and another way in another question. Now, let's go to the primary key and see how can we add the primary key as a constraint, but add it as a table level constraint instead of next to the attribute. So what you do is you come after you've defined all of your columns, and there's a comma at the end here, you put the word constraint, you give it a name, and then you say the constraint. So here I'm saying the constraint is that some column has to be the primary key, and in parentheses, you put the column that you are referring to. So let's go back to our table and let's drop this table again. And here, what I'm going to do, instead of putting my constraint on this line, I'm going to put it at the end. So I'm going to say constraint, and I'm going to give it the name primary toy ID. And what I want to identify is that I have a primary key column, and the primary key column is called toy ID. And so I no longer need these 4 words over here. So I'm just going to remove them from here. So what I just did was I removed the constraint from being at the attribute level, and I moved it to be at the table level. Okay, and we could do that with all the other ones too. Let's just test this out. So it just got created again. Let's refresh our table here, and let's close it and double click on it again. And I should see the same information. I see that those 2 are there, and I go to the constraints and I see my primary toy ID. That is the primary key. So nothing really changed in the description of my table, the representation here in Oracle, just because I moved from one type of constraint to the other.